What if almost all of America's social and policy challenges could be blamed on the decline of one major human behavior?
What matters more than all of that is the character and quality of our relationships. And for most people, nothing matters more than their marriage.
On this episode, we talk with Sutherland visiting scholar Brad Wilcox about his new book, Get Married. And we discuss why marriage and family is an institution under attack in some circles. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're pleased to welcome back to the podcast Brad Wilcox. He's a visiting scholar here at Sutherland Institute. He's also a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the Institute for Family Studies and a sociologist at the University of Virginia. And he's the author of the new book, Get Married. Brad, we are so glad to have you back on Defending Ideas. Thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here, Nick.
I want to talk about your book, Get Married, the subtitle, Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. Very compelling subtitle, some of the buckets that we'll talk about today. But first, kind of give us the overall pitch. What argument does the book make, and why do you think it's important today?
Well, Nick, as we head into Valentine's Day, I think it's just kind of worth underlining some good news. And that good news is that Americans who are married are enjoying kind of a level of financial security, kind of protection from loneliness, and also a sense of happiness that isn't kind of sort of available elsewhere. So it's just something about marriage per se that is valuable for our Americans in terms of, financially, socially, and emotionally. And I think we can't lose sight of that. And the paradox really, Nick, is that even as kind of marriage loses ground, we're seeing on a lot of indicators, like some of the ones I've just touched on, like that the actual returns on marriage seem to be growing. So that's sort of the good news, is that if you're all kind of interested in this institution, there are a lot of good things that tend to kind of flow from getting married and in many cases going ahead and having kids.
Would you say that your book is more of, which way does it lean? More of a sort of self-help, here's how to achieve happiness, versus here's a civic institution that can help solve our public policy challenges?
Yeah, I really aim to do both of those things, but I think it's primarily trying to kind of explain to people why this institution that's been, around for millennia is still quite relevant, and then kind of given its relevance, its importance for the welfare of kids, adults, and communities in the country at large. How can Americans forge strong families? I've got 5 C's I talk about in the book that are connected to stronger and more stable marriages.
You touch on a couple of things, falling rates of happiness, loneliness and despair rising, and we can see that in rates of mental illness, deaths of despair, things like that, crime rates, and also this concept of the American dream being out of reach for folks. Essentially, make the argument for why it's easy to look at a lot of those and see, well, there's all kinds of variables that are affecting those things. Why do you think marriage is the most crucial variable affecting things like happiness, loneliness, crime, and the American dream?
So I think there are 2 kind of ways to answer that question. One is to sort of just basically make the point that empirically, when we kind of measure things like family structure and marriage, whether you're Raj Chetty at Harvard, in economics, basically finding that family structure is the most powerful predictor of mobility for poor kids in communities across the U.S., or whether you're kind of an economist at Chicago looking at the drop in happiness since 2000 in the U.S. and finding that marriage is the best predictor of that. There's kind of an empirical piece I think that we can talk about, right? But what I would also sort of say is that we are social animals, as Aristotle said. And so kind of the degree on our wall, the amount of money in our bank account, all these things are important, but what matters more than all of that is the character and quality of our relationships. And for most people, nothing matters more than their marriage. So one of the things that I find in the book is that, yes, happiness is linked to money and work and sex and religious attendance, but nothing predicts happiness like a good marriage. And I think that's because marriage gives us an opportunity to have someone in our corner, a co-pilot, if you will, as you kind of travel through life. But also it gives you so many opportunities to grow in virtue, if you're a decent husband or wife. And we see too that sort of the interesting thing about sort of happiness in marriage, which is so important, is that kind of directly pursuing it is kind of not a very sensible approach. But people who are generous towards their spouses, assuming that they make a decent selection about who they marry, end up being much more likely to be happily married. So it's a kind of an opportunity to grow in the virtue of generosity among other virtues. And that's a virtue that tends to redound to people's benefit in ways that they often don't always appreciate.
I want to see if we can draw an analogy to a concept in our free enterprise system that I think is pretty well established, the idea of the invisible hand for folks who maybe studied economics way back when in school. Just this idea that if I'm pursuing things that are good in my own self-interest, I start a business, I want to make money, that is going to have a positive effect on society as well. There's kind of these positive externalities. Do you think that metaphor could be applied to marriage, that if I pursue marriage and family for me, because I want that level of fulfillment, there's sort of this, I'm accidentally making my community better as well?
No, I would sort of flip that. And I would say that, I think people obviously are attracted for, a variety of reasons to someone. Romantic, sexual, intellectual, there's some kind of friendship that's formed. So it's certainly I'm not saying that the sort of the individual is and the self is not important in all of this. But I think once you are married, really trying to prioritize the welfare of your spouse and your kids and your family as a whole ends up being the way to do it. So I talk about in the book kind of the difference between kind of a me first approach to marriage and a kind of more we before me approach to marriage. And, I think people who are kind of trying to be good spouses, whether it's, cooking, cleaning, playing with one's young son, taking kids, on hikes and shuffling to soccer and basketball, all that stuff. If you're kind of doing those things and trying to do them well, rather than just kind of coming home and staring at your phone or ESPN, or whatever else it might be, it's the former strategy that's going to lead to everyone being much happier than if you have a more me first approach to your marriage. So I think being pretty deliberate about kind of trying to live for others in the context of family life is the ticket.
Maybe let me put this layer on it then, because so my wife and I, back when we were dating, she said this one. She said you should be selfish in dating, but then selfless in marriage.
It's a great formulation.
And maybe that's a better way to think about it.
Can we have her write an article about that for
please,
family studies?
But that idea that, hey, when I'm seeking to become married and seeking to create a family, I'm in someone who's dating, it is kind of like, well, I want this fulfillment in my life. But then as soon as you're in the institution of marriage, then everything becomes about your husband or wife. It becomes about your kids when you have kids. So maybe that's a better way to ask what I mean, that you get into it in the first place because you're looking for fulfillment for yourself. But then once you're in the institution, just the nature of it sort of forces you to live for other people. And that's where now, whether it's conscious or not, you are sort of forced to accidentally better the community by virtue of being in that institution.
Yeah, although the hard thing, right, is thinking about the nature and character of romantic love and marital love. And I think there's a transition that takes place where the romantic love can be more self-centered and successful marital love is more other-centered. But I think there comes a point when, in like a good romantic relationship where you begin to sort of really kind of internalize, right, the good of the other. There's a good match, a good friendship, and that then sort of shifts your orientation. So that's sort of there's a transition that takes place. And I think that's what we don't see enough of in part today, is that people are kind of moving into that space where they're really kind of internalizing the good of the other, and the other's good becomes as, important as their own desires and dreams and whatnot.
So one thing I want to ask you, in the summary for the book and the description, and you alluded to this, but it uses the phrase or the line, nothing predicts happiness in life better than a good marriage, not even a hefty bank account or a great career. doesn't that kind of run counter to the things that we track? So I think sort of traditional conventional wisdom it's the intangibles in life that are most important. And I think to a large extent as a society, we still believe that's true. But then you look at any metric about happiness, any metric about the American dream, all of the data that, folks we're friends with in the think tank world and in government, they're measuring things like what's in your bank account or the types of jobs you have, even measures for, whether or not Utah is a good state for women or men or things like this. It's measuring these external materialistic things such as work, income, and those kinds of things. Is there just a huge gaping hole that we're not measuring the kind of life satisfaction that comes from marriage and family? So we're sort of missing what really is what the American dream is about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is kind of an excessive focus on economics, and it's not obviously unimportant. I mean, what we see in my book, for instance, is that there are 4 groups of basically Americans who I describe as masters of marriage. And what I mean by that is they're more likely to be married in the first place, to be happily married in the second place, and to be stably married in the third place by and large. And so one of the things that kind of predicts whether or not people are kind of flourishing in their marriages is whether or not they have a steady stream of cash. So economics matters. There's no doubt about that. But it's not the only thing, of course, that matters. And so, yeah, I think we would do better to measure things like, and I think that's beginning to happen now because of things like this growth and deaths of despair. But to measure loneliness, to measure a sense of meaning in one's life, to continue to think about happiness and their relationship to these core social institutions.
Let me ask you this, Brad, because for a lot of folks, this might sound like common sense. And I think sometimes when we've talked about other things in the past, like the success sequence, finishing your school, working full time, and if you're going to have kids, get married first. 97% of folks who do that avoid poverty. We've heard from folks, well, isn't that kind of common sense? So with what you're talking about, maybe another way to phrase it is, why did you feel the need to write this book? Is this not common sense anymore, that marriage and family is an anchoring part of a happy life?
Yes, I think, from my great-grandparents, most of the things that I would say in the book would be pretty commonsensical. But 2024 is not 1924, obviously. And so it's important just to acknowledge we live in a moment, a day and age when marriage is kind of coming under fire from folks in the mainstream left. I mean, if I had $1 for every article that was written since 2020 in mainstream, media publications, either kind of deriding marriage or deriding motherhood, I'd be a pretty rich guy. So there are ways in which I think the mainstream left has been painting a pretty negative portrait of marriage, particularly for women. And we've seen some polling evidence now that Americans think that, marriage is still a pretty good deal for men, but not so much for women. So that's one thing that we're kind of dealing with. But we're also dealing now with, the rise of kind of an online right, what others have called kind of the red pill right. And their whole idea is that men are ill-served by our society and that marriage is a bad deal for men. And they think that, most marriages end in divorce, and that so basically men should steer clear of marriage. I begin my book talking about Andrew Tate, for instance, who's probably the most public and prominent proponent of this view. And he basically says, guys, don't get married. Just make a lot of money, get strong, but don't invest in women, and steer clear of marriage. And that's kind of, from his perspective, the path to prosperity and the path to happiness. Now, of course, he's dead wrong on a number of fronts. Number one, financially, guys in their 50s heading towards retirement who are stably married have 10 times the assets as their never married and divorced peers. Okay. So what his approach is not acknowledging is that actually for most men, the path to prosperity runs right through marriage. Okay. So that's one point. When it comes to divorce, which is a legitimate concern, we have seen the divorce rate in the US fall by about 40% since 1980. And so most marriages that are formed today are going to go the distance, and the divorce rate continues to drop. That's probably because it's a more selective institution, but regardless, it's not the case anymore that 1 in 2 marriages end in divorce. Okay, probably closer to 40%. It looks like that continues to drop. And the final thing that I would say is that there's just no question that married men, especially married fathers, are the happiest men out there. When you look at, kind of just sort of categorizing American men and women, this goes to the left's point too, like the left is wrong to say that marriage and motherhood are a bad deal for women, at least in the sense that women who are married are better off financially as well. And they're also happier than their peers who are not married. And surprisingly, for all of the kind of media commentary often emanating from Brooklyn, New York, I don't know what it is about the Brooklyn thing, but a lot of these writers from Brooklyn have a thing about marriage or motherhood. But for ordinary women across this country, there is no group of women who are happier than married moms. And I think that's because, your life is full. It's rich. Yeah, it's stressful. There's fatigue, all this kind of stuff. That's clearly in the data as well. But, taking your kids to soccer practice, watching your kids play basketball, seeing them, learn piano, taking your kids to church if you're religious. It just adds so much meaning to your life. And then, at the end of the night, one of my twin daughters will come up and wherever I am in the house, she'll hunt me down and give me a kiss on the forehead. I mean, that's just like, you're just not going to get that in any other context. So they're just, the folks who are kind of, I think, denigrating marriage and parenthood just don't really appreciate how much, having other human beings to sort of share your life with is, yes, it can be difficult and challenging, but in the main, it's a good and great thing.
In my own life, I got married a handful of years ago, and we have 2 little kids now. I very much enjoyed all of the experiences I had in young adulthood and adulthood before getting married, but I always looked forward to it and was very excited about it. But now as a father, when, for example, our toddler, we got him a little toy basketball set for Christmas, just the little cheap plastic Lifetime things. And seeing him go grab the little rubber basketball and say, let's play basketball, and, grab my hand and go over there and play. It's things like that, those little moments that give a much deeper sense of fulfillment and joy and purpose than anything else in my life that I could measure. And I wonder how much of this ties into the concept of being needed. There's, when you look at, and I know you've looked at this before, that when you look at the rates of mental health challenges, especially for men, or you look at suicidal ideation among men, there seems to be a pretty strong correlation between this sense of worthlessness, of I'm not needed, I'm not useful, nobody needs me. And I guess what I'm asking is, can marriage and family act as an anchor to say that you are needed? This is a really important aspect of your purpose in life, is to take care of your spouse, take care of your kids, have a healthy, flourishing family. Is this, I guess, is marriage just to a certain extent an antidote to some of the mental health crises we're facing in this country?
Completely. And I think, I interviewed both women and men in their mid-30s for this book who were single. And at that point, kind of involuntarily single. One guy who I call Scott in the book is in the outer suburbs of DC, and he kind of just talks about coming home Monday through Friday, walks his dog, makes dinner or eats out, watches some TV, goes to bed, and that's it basically. And he's just, really lamenting the fact that he doesn't have a family to come home to and care for. And, so there's just a profound sort of emptiness that he articulates, in the interview context. And he kind of spent his 20s, on dating apps and, kind of living the life, but he really regrets that he was not more intentional as a 20-something guy about finding someone and, and getting married at that point. And I talked to a woman in her 30s here in the Rocky Mountain West, who's also single. mid-30s, and talking about how she takes care of her nieces and nephews, and who are toddlers, and just loves playing with them, being with them, caring for them, but realizes that, she really didn't prioritize as well kind of finding a spouse in her 20s. And she now thinks that, her prospects for marriage are pretty slim. And there's just a profound sense of loss, both in terms of marriage, but also in her case, more in terms of motherhood as well. So I think, the point of the book in part is to kind of get 20-somethings especially to recognize, to realize that for many of us, there's no better time to meet someone, whether it's in college or work or, in your community or your church, whatever it might be, and not just to kind of take it for granted that you're going to find someone when you're 28 or 31, but you might find someone as I did, in a college classroom who ends up being your spouse a couple of years later.
Let me ask you about that. Then we do need to take a quick break, but this is a good point. I don't want to lose the momentum on this. When you talk about people you talk with people who are involuntarily single, I like that term because it captures it well, which was my case. I mentioned it, got married a handful of years ago. So for all of my 20s, I was going on lots of dates, really trying to find the woman that I wanted to marry. And so it wasn't for lack of trying. It just didn't happen until a little bit later. And I wouldn't change anything for the world. But for those folks who say, Brad, I want to get married, I'm trying, get off my back, like I'm giving it everything I can. What's the right message to those folks? How do we sort of preach the societal and personal benefits of marriage and family without making those folks feel like I'm trying here? What's the right answer? Yeah,
so there was a piece in the New York Times, maybe 2 months ago, kind of pushing back at the thesis of the book, and saying that I was scolding, women who are struggling to find men in their lives who would be good marriage partners. And there's certainly plenty of that, I think, for both sexes, although in somewhat different ways and somewhat different, dynamics and numbers. But yeah, I know plenty of folks in their 20s and 30s who are interested in getting married, but haven't found someone who kind of, would be a good spouse. So that's a fair point. And I think there are social things that we can do, public policies, cultural changes we can make to kind of make it easier for people to find someone worthy of marriage. But I think it's also the case that there are plenty of young adults and now plenty of parents, unfortunately, who think that the 20s are the time just to focus in a singular way on education, career, and maybe having a good time, having fun. And that we don't need to worry about finding a spouse. Plenty of students who come to me at office hours at UVA and their parents have told them basically, do not get serious with someone at UVA. You should be focusing just on your studies and getting launched in your career. Recent Pew poll, I wrote up, basically talking about how parents now are more likely to prioritize their kids' educational and professional future than getting married. And I'm like, what are you thinking? You're going to be a very lonely person in your old age if you've kind of given your kids the message that what really matters is a job and not a family, because they may end up just getting a great job but not having a family. And there are plenty of young adults today who just have no thought of dating with an eye towards marriage, no thought of their family future. They kind of think that they're just going to get married around 30, but they're not being intentional about putting themselves in situations and meeting people in ways that might facilitate marriage. So I think for people who've done, the work of trying to find a spouse or find a boyfriend or girlfriend, this book is not in any way correcting them, but there are plenty of folks, I think, who just kind of don't, are not kind of taking the steps one, could take and should take. And it goes beyond just kind of like looking to date. I think for young men, it's like there are a lot of young women who are complaining about the men in their lives not having a sort of a clear sense of identity and purpose and mission. So I think for young men, it's partly kind of encouraging them to recognize the importance of having their own sense of mission, developing some kind of professional interest. You don't have to go to college, but, get a skill, be worthy in a particular, job environment of, recognition, appreciation, and a decent salary. And that will make you more marriageable. I think also get in shape. There are plenty of young men out there who are not in great shape. and that's going to affect their ability, their capacity to garner the interest of someone as well. And so there are things that people can do to kind of elevate their prospects for getting married, if that's at all a priority or concern for them in the future.
Well, let's take a quick break. When we come back, I want to sort of coalesce maybe these two buckets. There's different messages for different audiences. The ones who are already bought in to marriage and family and they're just trying, and we need societal reforms to help them achieve it, and those who are maybe downplaying the importance of it. So I want to tease that out a little bit more and then finish off by sort of talking about some of these anti-marriage messages and what to do about it. What should next steps be for us as a state, as a country? So we'll get into that when we come right back. We're talking with Brad Wilcox, author of the new book, Get Married. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn, and we've been talking with Brad Wilcox, who's the author of the new book, Get Married: Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. Before we get back into the conversation with Brad, I want to mention if you are enjoying what you're hearing today, please visit us at defendingideas.org. You can subscribe to this podcast on any of the major platforms, Apple, Google, Spotify, wherever you like to get your shows. Just type Defending Ideas into the search bar and click that subscribe button. You can also find short clips from this episode and previous shows that you can use on social media and in your conversations with friends and family. Find us on YouTube and once again at defendingideas.org. Brad, you mentioned something before the break that seemed to, I think, capture maybe two audiences or two sets of messages that you would say we need to argue better in this discussion about marriage and family. And number one, it seems to me that there are lots of young people who are already sold. They agree with you, marriage is important, family is important, they aspire to that. They're dating, they're trying to meet people and trying to find the right person. It just hasn't happened yet. And then the second bucket is there are people who say, nope, that's not important to me either right now or ever. And some of the anti-marriage messages, as you mentioned, in maybe our media and pop culture, is that the right way to frame it? And if so, how do you solve both of those problems simultaneously that seem like very different challenges?
Yeah, so I think for folks who are already marriage-minded, I think it's important to think about even creative and new ways, both kind of individually and collectively, to make it easier to find someone. So I think, for instance, I interact with a lot of young adults in my work, and, one thing that I think is helpful is sort of having like the matchmaker thing going. Like you meet one student and you realize, and they're looking to get married, and then you meet another student who has the same kind of intention, and they haven't been experiencing success, and you introduce them to one another. So that would be kind of or young adult professionals, the same kind of story right there. I think another thing that I'm seeing play out at the University of Virginia is that they're kind of organizing more formal dances for peers who are more marriage-minded. This is a new thing, right? And I think that's a great opportunity just to kind of, do something fun and just meet people in a new way. So there needs to be kind of more of that activity, sort of what we kind of classically would have called, courtship-related activities, in an older era. So just reviving new forms of all of that social activity and matchmakers kind of looking out for people and trying to help them find someone. But I think we also have to kind of realize that our culture is not very conducive, to marriage in important ways. And so, you get everything from mainstream publications making, quote, the case against marriage, on the one hand, to kind of innumerable, shows and songs that kind of basically are broadcasting a very kind of live for the moment ethos when it comes to relationships that is not conducive to developing the kind of deep connection with someone that's going to lead, to a wedding. So there's these cultural dynamics playing out. And then we're seeing, I think, real problems with kind of men not flourishing in school and work in their early 20s. And so we kind of, I think, need to revive a sense of 21st century masculinity for them to kind of give them a strong sense of their own identity and the opportunities and skills to really flourish as young men, both so they have a greater sense of self-confidence, and they also are more attractive to potential romantic partners. So that's a task that's related to schooling and the culture and parenting, and that includes too, I think, trying to figure out ways to get young men off of screens and off of gaming platforms and into the real world, where they can develop real skills and do better in school and better at work. So these are some of the kinds of challenges facing us. We've talked before, Nick, about kind of things like public policy and the ways in which we tend to penalize work for working class couples who are having kids as well. So there are a variety of things that sort of need to happen to make, I think, marriage more both attractive in the culture at large and more attainable both economically and policy-wise.
How much do you think there's an argument of ultimate individual freedom, free from any constraints, is the ideal? And what I mean by that is the way you're describing this, sort of anti-marriage trend in some of our pop culture and some of our media seems to be implying that any institution in life that creates a sense of constraints around you is bad, because if it's limiting any part of your life, that's not a good thing. You should be able to be totally free to do whatever you want, whenever you want, all the time. And of course, there can be merits to sort of the argument of, we should have freedom to live our lives as we choose, of course. But so much of the data that you've done and the argument you're making now is that these institutions that you could view through the lens of constraints, but are really our responsibilities. I have a responsibility to my wife. I have a responsibility to my kids, a responsibility to my community, to my faith congregation. These are actually the ingredients that create happy people. So have we just been arguing the wrong thing for decades, saying it's not just about we should have a society where you can do whatever you want. It's, yes, we want freedom. We want individual liberty. No one's arguing against that. But socially, culturally, we should have institutions where you have some obligations, because that's how we build a civilization.
Yeah, no, that's certainly right. I mean, I think people have to understand and appreciate that strong societies require strong institutions, and they require norms, and they require people to abide by those norms and to kind of develop certain kinds of skills and excellences. And then the thing about that, though, is that you then take pride as a husband and wife, father and mother, for developing in the context of the family certain sets of skills that enable you to create, a warm and happy home where people like spending time, where good meals are served, where, fun things are done, and where productive work also takes place. And I think one thing, just as a side note, that I found in doing the research with Jeff Dews, a scholar down the road at BYU, we looked at kind of how doing fun things as a family was linked to marital happiness, and found, not surprisingly, that families that did, things like, hikes and going to sporting, events were happier. But we also found that actually doing chores together as a family was an even better predictor of marital quality, which kind of struck me with a bit of surprise, because for us, every Saturday morning is kind of torture trying to get all of our kids to do their chores. But I think it just sort of, it's about, in part, kind of like doing productive work for your family is actually pretty important and meaningful. And so, and it just goes to your deeper point that, kind of just sort of living for yourself, pursuing one dopamine hit after another, whether it's through food or through, social media or an Xbox, can be nice in the moment, but over any period of time, it's a pretty miserable life.
So basically, when my wife and I, when we have a laundry party fold all the clothes. We're not just doing a chore. We're engaging in high-level cognitive development for our kids, essentially, right?
Yeah, but I think what's interesting, so there was some research done on kids who were raised in Iowa, and they had a sample that was based in part on kids being raised on the farm. And they had a suburban sample of Iowa kids as well. And what they found is that over the course of their lives, the Iowa kids who were raised on farms tended to do a lot better on many important outcomes. And so I think and we don't live on a farm, my wife and I. So, but I think the challenge is to try to keep figuring out new ways to kind of give our children meaningful chores and have a meaningful role in family. It's also, I think too, there's been a lot of, complaining, shall we say, about housework and who does what and how they divide it all between husbands and wives. But I think part of the problem with some of these contemporary couples is they don't realize that actually your kids have arms, they have heads. You can kind of give them chores, and it's, it can, as it is often for us, can be, difficult to get them to do the chores. But I think just kind of recognizing that the work of the home is not just obviously the moms, it's both the moms and the fathers, and then also the children's. And I think kind of trying to build, an ethic around kind of domestic work in the home is one that all of us could be doing more on that front.
So one thing I want to ask you before we start to wrap up is trying to think through what some of the counter arguments might be to this overall message. And one that comes to mind, I was speaking with a relative a little while back and talking about the concept of marriage being a good thing for society and why we should promote it more. And I was making this argument. And the pushback was, traditionally, according to this argument, marriage has been filtered through the lens of morality and religion. And so for folks today who maybe are not as religious, is there still sort of this association with marriage? Well, it's a religious thing as opposed to a societal thing with economic benefits. And so how do we get around that? Is it that, I guess first, has the decline in pro-marriage culture, in your view, in your reading of the evidence, correlated with a decline in religiosity? And if so, what do we do about it? Do we try and have a more religious culture, which would be a tall order, or do we decouple marriage from religious values? How do you navigate those connections?
Yeah, well, I think it's important just to kind of be very clear here. There are some critics of marriage in the U.S. who would say it's a Christian thing or a religious thing, and I'm saying no. Look, get an anthropology textbook, buddy, and read up, right? Because marriage is a human universal in large civilizations, right? So looking at China, looking at India, looking at Nigeria, looking at Egypt, very different societies, not to mention Europe, just saying this is sort of how we organize kinship relationships in complex civilizations. You need to have ways that women and men, navigate romantic relationships, navigate family life. And obviously not everyone's going to get married. Not everyone should get married. Some marriages don't work, but that on average, a healthy society, no matter what its religious character, will have kind of some way of organizing, family life through the institution of marriage. So that's sort of, I think, important not to lose sight of the fact that, or to put it differently, kind of in more evolutionary terms, we're hardwired to connect, to pair bond. Now, we're also, I think, hardwired to engage in other behavior that's not about, but so I think marriage is sort of steering women and especially men in the direction of pair bonding, which ends up being good for them and their kids and for the civilization itself. So that's the sort of secular case that I would make quickly about marriage. We know that, kids, and I think especially men, are more likely to flourish long-term when they enjoy the benefit of marriage. But even women are also more likely to flourish when they're married, but also when they're living in married societies, because those married societies are safer, they're more prosperous, and they're more likely to have a modicum of order that's good for women's personal safety as well. So that's the secular point. Now, it's true that I think religion, both here in the United States right now, today, tends to support marriage more than other institutions. And, there's a long-standing relationship in the West between Christianity and marriage, between Judaism and marriage. And So yeah, if we see some kind of religious revival, I think that's going to be coupled then with a revival in the fortunes of marriage. But I just want to be clear here that we can think about secular reasons why marriage matters, and we can point to the fact that people who are not religious but are married are more likely to be flourishing as well.
Brad, we're about at time for this episode, but I want to see if we can get you to give our listeners just a firm call to action. What would you want them to do? Either what should they do? What should each of us do in our own lives? Or from a policy lens, what should we tell our elected officials? How do we, in the words of the subtitle, help save civilization?
Well, I think kind of just recognizing, again, that marriage is not just an institution for your own personal pleasure, but it really has, a profound impact on your kids and on your community. And so kind of your success, if you're married as a spouse, matters, again, not just for yourself or your family, but for your broader community, even in a sense at the macro level of the country. But I think in terms of the call to arms, I'd say for people who are not married, I would say, be kind of deliberate about asking people out on dates, being open to dating, figuring out kind of new ways to meet young adults who might make good marital prospects. If you're in a good relationship, I would think a lot more profoundly than many do about kind of, should we go ahead and get married? Is there a good relationship? Is there a good friendship here? Do we have some common values and dreams and other things that would be the basis for a strong marriage? I think for those who are married, recognizing that there are things that they can do to strengthen their marriage. I talk about, among other things, the importance of communion, commitment, and community. So when it comes to communion, for instance, I think a lot of long married couples can sort of fall into sort of almost like a roommate phase, or pattern. And so it's important to kind of keep cultivating that more romantic connection. So regular date nights where you're mixing it up is one way to kind of do that in terms of fostering that communion, but also recognizing the importance of commitment, and recognizing that the quality of your marriage will ebb and flow, and that you need to be, there for the long haul, and also sensitive about not kind of paying attention to attractive alternatives, both in the real world and now in the virtual world. That your focus should be, on your spouse and not on competitors. So that's part of what kind of the commitment piece is, and then community, kind of surrounding yourself with people who are committed to their marriages and their families. And if you do that, and that often happens in religious contexts, but not always, if you do that, you're more likely, there's very clear evidence, for instance, that divorce is socially transmitted. So if you're surrounded by people who are divorced or divorcing, you're more likely to get divorced, way more likely. Nicholas Christakis at Yale has found this. By contrast, if your friends are stably married and kind of more family-oriented, your odds of divorce, fall precipitously. So I think it's just kind of being strategic about kind of, understanding that you are your friends in important ways. And so pick wisely and spend time with people who are going to be good for you, your spouse, and your family. And then the public policy angle, just to recognize and appreciate that there are cultural and economic steps that we can take, which I articulate in the book, things like, pursuing the success sequence in our public schools. And on the policy front, pursuing a child tax credit that is going to make family life easier for people who are raising children, especially people who are working and married as well. And then the final thing that I would say is that our elites, who often benefit themselves personally from strong marriages and families, need to do more, in a sense, to sort of share the good news. And so if you're a school superintendent, for instance, of a large public school district, odds are you're in a decent marriage, maybe a great marriage. You're relatively affluent. You're benefiting from, this sort of inheritance of Western family traditions. You could share that inheritance with the students in your district. If you're a Hollywood, producer or director, you could, in a decent relationship, a marriage, you could do more to share that, the wisdom that is associated with a marriage to a broader public audience. I talk in the book, for instance, about Reed Hastings, who's the co-founder of Netflix. In his autobiography, he talks about how he and his wife hit a rough spot because he was traveling a lot for his work, and she thought that he was too work-centered. Surprise, surprise, the big entrepreneur that he was. And so they went to marital counseling, and they worked through these issues. They've gone on to have a marriage that's extended more than 30 years, 2 kids, the whole 9 yards. And yet his platform, I think, in many ways is not kind of advancing the kinds of values and virtues. And I'm not looking for some kind of like treacly, rose-colored thing, but I think just sort of to be even more honest. So they had this big, movie called Marriage Story, and I'll end with this. And Marriage Story tells the tale of 2 kind of cultural professionals in New York and Los Angeles who have a son. And over kind of like petty disagreements and professional tensions about how they're going to navigate work and family, end up getting divorced for what, to my mind, is really like there's no real reason that they should have gotten divorced. And so it ends up kind of painting a very dispiriting portrait of marriage in kind of the upper middle class in America today. Now, the problem with this movie in part is it's not even realistic, right? Because we're actually seeing in the real upper middle class is that divorce has fallen markedly since 1980. Most upper middle class Americans are getting married and they're staying married. Why couldn't they tell a true marriage story about that group of people for Netflix? So this is the lost opportunity. And so I just hope that our elites would do a better job of kind of using the influence and power and authority that they have to both advance marriage and just tell the truth.
Well, Brad, it's always a pleasure having you on the podcast. This has been a phenomenal discussion about some really great information for our listeners. So thank you again for joining us. The book, once again, is Get Married, Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization, by Brad Wilcox, who's also a visiting scholar here for us at Sutherland. Brad, thanks again for joining us on Defending Ideas.
Great to be with you here, Nick.
We're going to take one more quick break before we leave you with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm very grateful to Brad Wilcox, our visiting scholar here at Sutherland and a scholar at AEI, an Institute for Family Studies, and a sociologist at University of Virginia. He's got a long resume, but that shows his expertise, so we're glad he spent some time with us to talk about his new book, Get Married. The big question on my mind now is, what do we do with this information? What can we learn from the conversation with Brad that then we can use in our conversations with friends or family, or even with our elected officials? I captured some notes from this conversation that I think can help you and I in any of our future discussions on this issue. And I think there's really one key cohesive principle that we can share with folks when we're talking about this issue. And that's this: if you or I really care about a strong, prosperous, and happy America, we ought to recognize that the data is pretty overwhelming, that strong families anchored by strong marriages as a civic institution is really upstream from all these other things we deal with in policy and law and the public debates that we have. So if you can view that institution as an anchoring institution, that when families are strong, so many of these other issues improve as a result. That principle should influence our culture and our public policies that we debate and discuss and ultimately pass. So I think if we focus on that, that'll help elevate some of the conversations we have about this, and again, help to elevate what's really an important civic institution in a public way, and maybe be informative for ourselves and our own private lives as well. That's it for this episode. We're so grateful that you spent some time with us. If you liked what you heard today, please visit defendingideas.org and subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Google, Spotify, wherever you like to listen to podcasts. Search for Defending Ideas and click subscribe. Share it with your friends and family. You can also find short clips on YouTube that you can share in your conversations and on your social media channels. Once again, that's defendingideas.org. Please visit and give us a follow. Well, that's it for this episode of Defending Ideas. Thanks so much for spending your time with us. From the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City, I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.